as you say, I did check a month off to view the garden therapeutic, but I've been involved in a project, and I'd like to speak to you about that, because I've always had a hankering to write a book about Burns, and I went to speak to Professors Murray Pittock and Jerry Carruthers at the Robert Burns Centre in Glasgow, and told them that I wanted to write a book about Robert Burns statues around the world, which they said was a good idea, and therefore I've been collaborating and working with them. Because I've always taken the view that it's not just so much the artistic merit, I'm not so much interested in that. It's why is it there, and who put it there? Because when you get statues in places such as Barrie or Cheyenne, you can understand New York or Sydney. But why is there a statue to Robbie Burns in Cheyenne, Wyoming? I can understand if you put up one to Billy the Kid or why that. But Robbie Burns in Cheyenne, but there is. And then some say, well, there's hundreds. Well, there's not. Some say there's only a few. Well, actually, there's close to 40. There's 16. Well, one's a trick one, as I'll mention, in America. There's 9 in Canada. There's 7 or 8 in Australia. 4 in New Zealand. 1 in Belfast, London, and Tallinn, which is the Tartan Army. Some will say that all comes from rich Scots. Well, some did, and I'll mention Carnegie. But if you look at Winnipeg and Vancouver, it came from ordinary working Scots, and those of Scots descent, putting in $5, $2, $1, 25 cents, 20 cents. It was contributed by ordinary working people. So it wasn't all just the rich and famous, nor was it all Scots. Because as I'll come to in Atlanta, there were actually people who just had a huge affinity for Burns and who wanted to welcome them. So let me take you on this odyssey as I've come to, because the first one I started out doing was Barrie, Vermont. And I thought, why? I didn't even know where Barrie, Vermont was. I had to Google it on Google Maps, and it's now part of basically metropolitan Montpellier, the state capital of Vermont. But why is there a statue to Burns there? But you do a bit more Googling and you find out that it's the granite capital of North America. And of course they recruited their workforce in the late 19th century. Not just from around the world, but in particular from Aberdeenshire. And it was Aberdeenshire looms that went there. And these weren't all rich men, far from it. Most of them were working men. Because I did come across that the first socialist mayor elected in Barrie, Vermont in 1915, a century before Bernie Saunders, was a guy called Robert Gordon from Fraserburgh, who was elected on the Socialist Labour Party's ticket of Eugene Debs. So that's the story of Barrie, Vermont. But I was intrigued and moved on to Cheyenne, because as I say, I just couldn't understand Cheyenne. But the story about Cheyenne relates to a Plumen laddie from Ayrshire, because Andrew Gilchrist was born in near Ayr, where his dad was a farmer in 1842. And some 20 years later, he emigrated with his wife Mary, also from Scotland, in 1865 to the United States, and they moved west to Cheyenne. They got there in or about 1870. That was before the Battle of the Little Bighorn. That was still to come. He made it big in ranching, he made it big in banking and finance, and he died. And thankfully he wasn't involved in taking the native people's land. There were other places where shamefully we did that, and we have to record the things that we did that were wrong, just as we have to record the things that we did that we should be proud of. But when he died, his wife wanted to put up a statue to his favourite poet, and a statue that would also represent the country from which she and he came from. And so that's why 30 years later, the statue to Robert Burns was put up in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The first statue went up actually in about 1830. The last one went up in the year 2000 in Edinburgh, in Alberta. But as I say, let's continue the journey, because people say at least Scots societies, they can be right strange. I've spoken at a few burn suppers at Scots societies. I was saying to Christina and Robert, and they spoke at what was classified as the highest burn supper, because it was held by the Toronto St Andrews Club in the revolving tower at the top of a restaurant at the top of the CN Tower, which probably did mean it was the highest burn supper. And some of the dress can be garish. Even in my Tartan Army days, I never dressed like some of what I see there. But we can mock this and say, well, I just feel like expat Scots, you get maudlin and tears to a glass eye singing Scots songs, but there's also things to be proud of. Because let me tell you the story of Boston. Because the Boston Scots were formed almost a century before Burns was even born. Because the history of the Boston Scots is the history of the Scots Charitable Society of Boston, which was founded in 1657. Why was it founded in 1657? Because in 1650 we had the trauma of the defeat at the Battle of Dunbar. And I'll be heading back to Dunbar after this. And the captured Scots soldiers, those that survived the walk of death down to Durham, were sent abroad. Cromwell sold some to the French. He tried to sell some to the Venetians, who declined the offer. He tried again, and the Venetians still declined the offer, wouldn't take the Scots soldiers to fight the Ottoman Empire in Crete. Some were sent to Barbados in the West Indies, and that was a ticket to an early grave. The fortunate ones were sent to New England, and they were sent on 7 years penal servitude. And that ended in 1657. And there was no way home, there was no cheap flights, there was no liner even. So they banded into the Scots Society, a charitable society that's now probably the oldest charity still in existence in the USA. And it's certainly a society that's older than most charities that exist in Scotland. So we can mock some of these St Andrews societies, but you look at the history of them. They were formed for camaraderie and social purposes. But they were also found as a welfare place to look after widows, to look after orphans, and to even bury the dead. So we should take some pride in that. But I was speaking to the folk from Dunfermline, and I'll tell about that, because the story of Dunfermline actually relates to Pittsburgh. Because the story of the Burns statue in Pittsburgh, 4 out of the 8 who contributed to it were from Dunfermline. It was 8 men who contributed to it, 4 of them. But of course the story and the links between Dunfermline and Pittsburgh go beyond that, because those from Dunfermline will probably know that Pittsburgh, or Pittsburgh, is called so by Colonel Forbes, who was born at Pittencrieff House. And if you go for a walk through the park, you will see a flag to Colonel Forbes, who called Pittsburgh after Pitt the Elder, who was the minister at the time. So there's that link, and obviously Andrew Carnegie bought the park and the house and donated it to the people. And Carnegie was one of those 4 from Dunfermline. The second was Carnegie's cousin George Lauder, which probably explains why we brought Lauder College. The third was actually his second cousin, Thomas Morrison. And fourth was a laddie from Dunfermline who came to work for him, who took a shine and who he promoted up through the ranks. So the Burns statue in Pittsburgh basically relates to the Scots Charitable Society and takes us back to Dunfermline. And not all were rich, as I say. There were those that gave their cents and their dollars, but I especially like the story of Albany in New York, because that's where a woman called Mary Macpherson. And Mary was born in 1804 in Galdry in Fife, opposite the other side of the river, the Teesside. And she emigrated with her parents and her brother in 1819, and they got to Albany, where her dad became the keeper of the State House. It sounds a very grand title, but it was in fact just janitorial, not to denigrate the important role that janitors play, but that's what her father was. He was basically the janitor at the Capitol State House there. And when her father died, her brother took over, and he became the janitor there. And then when her brother died in about 1886, neither her nor her brother had married. They had no offspring in America. They had been your parsimonial, frugal Scots, so she was by all means a rather quirky dame. She was described in the papers in her obituary as riding on the horse-drawn tram cars, wearing a feather boa and rather voluminous clothes, whatever, for the time. But she left $60,000 in the middle 1880s. If you Google that, one half of it was to go for the Burns statue. It's actually the equivalent to $1 million today that she left for the Burns statue. So that's the story of, as I say, Albany. But the other one that end on is a trick cottage, because although there's 15 in America, say there's 16, because the 16th is actually not a statue of Robert Burns, It's a replica of Burns's cottage in Alloway. Now, not only is it a replica, it's a replica to every last detail, including the bend in the house and the cottage in Alloway that has to go with the road. That was added in at the turn of the century in the 1900s. And it's, for anybody who ever goes there, it's rather strange as you come up Confederate Avenue. I think they've changed the name now, into Alloway Drive. You see what literally is an apparition, because it is an exact replica of Burns's cottage. But that wasn't put up by expat Scots, or Scots of those of Scots descent. The prime mover was a man called Dr. Joseph Jacobs. Now, Dr. Joseph Jacobs was of German-Jewish origin, but he'd been born in Chicago. But he was a lover of Burns. He was the owner of numerous drugstores in Atlanta, quite a wealthy man, but a fan of the bar. Dr. Jacobs' claim to fame, other than setting up the cottage and the replica Burns cottage there, is that he operated a drugstore. And operating also in his drugstore was a chemist friend of his called Dr. Pemberton. And Dr. Pemberton had a cordial. And between Dr. Pemberton and Dr. Joseph, they actually decided to aerate and carbonate the cordial. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the history of Coca-Cola. They sold the company, but those of you who know Coca-Cola, and I had a bottle of Diet Coke kindly brought for me by Christina, will know that it's still headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. And that, as I say, started out with Dr. Joseph Jacobs. So if anybody like me was drinking Coca-Cola, diet or otherwise tonight, there was a legitimate reason and a link that perhaps allows you to have a Coca-Cola as opposed to a dram. So as I say, there are many, many more, because there's 40. Some are very touching, some are very poignant. But equally they're part of our history, because discussing with Murray Pittock and Jerry Carruthers, you can't write the history of Scotland without writing about those who have come here from foreign lands, whether from Ireland, whether from Italy, whether now from the Indian subcontinent or wherever else, and made this country a better place. You also can't write the history of Scotland and the Scots without writing about the history of those who left this land, whether forced out, whether going because there was no opportunities or chance for them here. But the story of Scotland and the Scots is not just set here, it's set around the globe. And that's why every Burns statue tells a story. Because in putting up a Burns statue, they were actually saying, this is who we are, this is where we came from. There was no, at that time, other than in Edmonton, Scottish Parliament. You didn't fly the Saltire. So when you wanted to say, what sort of people are we? You put up a statue to Burns, because in putting up a statue to Burns, you were putting up a statue to your nation's bard, but you were putting up a statue to what you thought represented the values of your people. Egalitarianism, a belief in education, a belief in home-setting and looking after each other. So a Burns statue was about saying who the Scots were, what they were, albeit in a vastly different land from the one they left behind.
One in Leith as well.
So much. Okay, and as those who are lucky to go to New England, some New Englanders are lucky to come here.